She looked at me like that, and my world stopped the moment I saw her. Something inside me shifted, like the air had thickened, and every sound, every movement, slowed down around her. She didn't do anything dramatic. She just stood there, leaning lightly against the counter, the faintest smile playing at the corner of her lips, eyes that seemed to catch light in ways I couldn't name. I had known her in passing before, small talk, polite smiles, but tonight, in this quiet, dimly lit cafe, she was something else. Something ungraspable, yet painfully close. I cleared my throat, trying to act casual, but my hands felt like they were suddenly foreign, and the cup of coffee I was holding seemed heavier than it had any right to be. She glanced up at me, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between our eyes. It wasn't just a look. It was a conversation without words. I could feel her attention brushing against me like a whisper, the subtle warmth of her gaze threading through my chest, pulling me forward and holding me there. She was in her mid-40s, graceful in the way confidence can't be taught. Her hair, dark with streaks of silver, framed a face that seemed both familiar and endlessly mysterious. There was an elegance in her posture, a fluidity in how she moved, yet something in the way she pressed her palm lightly against the counter, a tiny tremor, hinted at the vulnerability she never spoke aloud. I, on the other hand, was 22, a quiet observer more comfortable in the shadows than in the spotlight. Yet tonight, I couldn't look away. I watched the faint catch in her smile when I laughed at something small and absurd. I noticed how her fingers brushed mine for a fraction of a second when she passed me the sugar packet, and I felt it everywhere, electric, unsettling, intoxicating. The cafe was nearly empty, the air carrying the scent of roasted beans and faint vanilla from the candles flickering on the tables. Outside, the rain had started, soft taps against the window, a rhythm that seemed to echo the quickening of my pulse. I felt the heat of her presence, as if it had its own gravity. The brush of her sleeve as she adjusted her scarf sent a shiver up my arm. I was aware of the small space between us, the unspoken promise in her subtle tilt toward me, the way she let her fingers linger near mine a beat longer than necessary. We talked, brief, clumsy sentences at first. Her voice, smooth and warm, wrapped around me in a way that made me forget how to breathe properly. I noticed how she laughed, a sound soft and deliberate, and how her eyes held something she didn't say. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the invisible gap, but I held back, savoring the tension, the slow burn of being close but not touching. And then, just as the moment felt like it might break, the door at the entrance swung open with a creak, letting in a sudden draft and a shadowed figure I didn't recognize. She turned her head, her gaze snapping toward the interruption, and in that instant the delicate spell shattered. My chest tightened, my thoughts scattered, and I realized I hadn't even noticed I was holding my breath. She looked back at me for a split second, a flash of something unspoken, and my world, already off balance, tilted just a little more. I couldn't stop noticing her. Not really. Every glance felt deliberate, every small gesture a language I hadn't learned but somehow understood. And yet, there was caution woven into every movement of hers, like she knew the edges of desire and kept them just out of reach. We had settled into a corner booth after the initial interruption at the door. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming against the glass like a private soundtrack for our fragile, unspoken tension. I tried to appear casual, stirring my coffee too slowly, watching her from the corner of my eye. She laughed at something a couple at the next table said, and I noticed a flicker in her smile, a trace of something softer, almost wistful, before it disappeared. I had seen the way she looked at people sometimes, like she was measuring their worth, their intentions, their honesty. And I knew that look. She had been careful all her life. Careful to keep her walls up, careful to keep distance. Maybe that was why I was drawn to her. Maybe that was why my own defenses felt useless around her. We didn't talk about the past at first. But gradually, fragments emerged in between sips and pauses. I learned she had loved deeply once, or thought she had, and that it hadn't ended kindly. She carried a quiet caution like a second skin. Loneliness wasn't something she broadcasted, but it lingered around her like the faint scent of jasmine, subtle but persistent. I, too, had my shadows. First heartbreak, awkward failures, a feeling of being overlooked, but nothing prepared me for noticing her in ways I couldn't admit. How her hand brushed my arm when she laughed, how her eyes followed me when I moved. And worse, how I wanted her to. There was risk here. Social perception. Whispered judgments. The age gap that made the world whisper. Wrong. Even though my own chest thumped. Right. We both knew the boundary, and yet she leaned closer, just enough to feel the warmth of her presence without daring to close the gap entirely. Her breath brushed my ear as she whispered a question, and I realized I was holding my own, barely breathing, desperate not to betray how acutely aware I was of her nearness. We laughed over trivial things, but every sentence hung between us like a tightrope. And then, a pause, a moment where we simply looked at each other. Not speaking, not moving, just existing in that shared, charged space. Her hand rested on my shoulder, not forcefully, but intentionally, a light weight that sent ripples down my arm. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. And in that hesitation, in the tiny weight of her touch, I understood something. We were both aware of the risk. We were both aware of how easily the walls could crumble. And maybe, just maybe, we wanted them to. Her eyes held mine a beat too long. A soft smile curved her lips. And though she didn't speak, I felt it, a silent acknowledgement, a bond forming in the tension, delicate and electric, as if the space between us had become its own universe, charged and waiting. The cafe was quieter now, the rain outside relentless, drumming a rapid tattoo against the windows. We sat closer than usual, our knees brushing beneath the table, a tension that neither of us dared to name. I could feel her shoulder just inches from mine, the warmth radiating, and it made my own chest ache in a way that felt dangerous and wonderful all at once. Then, a chime from her phone startled us both. She glanced at it quickly, her expression flickering, a fraction of hesitation that spoke louder than words. I didn't see the message, but I saw the pulse of concern in her eyes. Something, or someone, threatened to intrude on the fragile bubble we'd built, and for a moment, I panicked at the thought of being exposed. Her hand brushed mine as she reached for the phone. That tiny, fleeting touch ignited every nerve ending in my arm. I froze, aware that we were teetering on an invisible edge. She looked up at me, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips, and I felt the world shrink again, down to the space between us. I wanted to close the gap, to lean in, to let the inevitable happen, but guilt and fear clenched my gut. What would people think? Was this even allowed? And yet, the thought of pulling away felt impossible, as though my body had decided before my mind could object. A soft laugh escaped her, light, almost breathless, and I realized her hand hadn't left mine entirely. She lingered, just enough for our fingers to press together, and I felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. Our glances locked, and I caught the almost imperceptible tremor in her lip as she bit it gently, a micro-behavior I read like a confession. Then came the pause. Silence thick with possibility. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, matching hers, I imagined. She tilted her head, the scent of her perfume brushing against me, making the air around us feel heavy, charged. I leaned slightly, just slightly, toward her, and I thought I saw her lips part as if inviting me in. A sudden noise, a chair scraping, someone entering the cafe, made her jerk back slightly. The spell broke, and our knees bumped awkwardly under the table. Her eyes darted away, cheeks faintly pink, and I felt a pang of frustration and longing all at once. But then she turned back, and the moment returned, fragile and magnetic. Her hand brushed mine again, this time deliberately, fingers grazing, lingering. My pulse quickened, and I realized we were closer than ever, inches apart, breathing each other's air. We both knew we shouldn't, and yet neither of us moved away. The world outside felt distant, irrelevant. For a heartbeat, it was just us, hearts thudding in unison, the weight of desire held in restraint. I wanted to ask, to speak, to close the gap completely, but the words died in my throat. Instead, I let the silence speak, let the touch linger, let the near kiss hang between us like a suspended promise. We were pulled closer than ever, even as our minds screamed to resist. And in that tension, in the quiet storm between glances and touches, I understood. The walls were cracking, and neither of us wanted to stop them. The cafe had emptied, leaving only the two of us, the soft hum of rain against the windows filling the gaps between words. I could feel the tension coiling between us like a live wire. Every glance, every movement carried weight, and I realized I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't take back. She reached for her coffee, and our fingers touched briefly. Just a brush, but it sent sparks crawling up my arm, settling deep in my chest. I swallowed hard, aware of how impossibly close she was, so close that I could see the faint shimmer of her eyelashes, the soft curve of her cheek catching the warm lamplight. I don't know if I should," she murmured, voice low, almost lost beneath the rain. Her words trembled, betraying the calm mask she wore so effortlessly. "You don't have to decide," I whispered, my own voice tighter than I intended, low and hesitant, near enough for her to feel the vibration. "Not yet." Her eyes flicked to mine, searching, questioning, and something broke in her posture. She leaned slightly, just enough for her hair to brush against my cheek, the scent of her perfume, warm, jasmine, filling the space between us. My hand itched to reach up, to tuck it behind her ear, to feel the small warmth of her skin. I didn't, not yet, but the desire pressed against my ribs so insistently that I could hardly breathe. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. The pause afterward was almost unbearable, filled with unspoken confessions. I nodded slowly, unable to stop myself from inching closer. My heart thudded in my ears, my pulse a frantic counterpoint to the rain outside. "All the time," I admitted. Words fragile, yet electric, carried the weight of everything we'd left unsaid. Her fingers found my hand curling into mine. The simple act was enough to make my stomach clench, a mix of yearning and guilt I hadn't expected. Her eyes dropped for a heartbeat, then returned to mine with a boldness that startled me. She was daring, despite herself, despite the rules we both knew existed. "I shouldn't," she whispered, her voice catching, and yet she didn't move away. Instead, she leaned just a fraction closer, the warmth of her shoulder pressing lightly against mine. I felt her breath brush my neck, and I wanted, needed, to close the final inch between us, to let everything spill over. And then she spoke my name, soft, deliberate, like a question, like a dare. My chest tightened at the sound, raw and intimate. My hand lifted, almost of its own accord, hovering near her face, trembling slightly. Every instinct screamed to stop, to resist, but desire was louder than caution. The moment stretched, endless, fragile, and unbearable. We were balanced on the edge of something we could never undo, suspended in a heartbeat that felt like it could shatter at any second. Then, the door swung open with a sharp creak, the sudden intrusion slicing through the spell. My heart lurched. Her eyes widened, catching mine, and for a brief, suspended instant, everything hung in that charged space: anticipation, hesitation, and the taste of what could have been. The cafe was nearly silent now, save for the last whispers of rain sliding down the windows. We sat in a lingering hush, both of us still recovering from the almost kiss, that electric pause that left our pulses racing. I thought we were alone, that the fragile bubble of tension was ours to savor, but then came the sharp, soft interruption of a familiar voice. "I didn't mean to overhear." I froze. She stiffened. Across the room, a friend of hers, someone I vaguely recognized from before, hesitated by the counter, eyes flicking between us. The words landed with unexpected weight, though nothing had yet been said aloud. Her breath hitched, small and involuntary. She shifted slightly, and in doing so, her hand brushed mine. Just a flicker of contact, but it carried the same shockwave of desire as before. My chest tightened, my fingers twitching with the urge to hold her, to anchor myself in the moment before the world intruded again. I didn't know you too," the friend began, voice unsure, and then trailed off, sensing the intensity that didn't need explanation. We both looked away, faces warming, caught somewhere between shame and exhilaration. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her hand lingering near my shoulder for just a heartbeat too long, and I felt the pull, the magnetic tug of proximity that neither of us wanted to fully resist. "What did you hear?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, but failing. It trembled, betraying my own guilt and longing all at once. Her eyes flicked toward me, then down at our hands, the brush of skin under the table sending a thrill I couldn't contain. "Nothing, really," she murmured, but her lips twitched in a way that suggested she was lying, or at least, withholding. Her shoulder brushed mine again as she shifted, a subtle claim of closeness in the smallest of movements. I wanted to demand honesty, to know the truth, but instead I let my hand linger, a light pressure that said more than words ever could. She responded in kind, pressing just a little closer, leaning against me in a way that was both defiant and fragile. The realization hit me then: nothing about this was safe. Every look, every touch, every heartbeat between us carried risk, social judgment, whispers, perhaps even consequences neither of us were ready to face. And yet the thought of stepping back felt unbearable, like denying gravity itself. Her eyes met mine again, a silent admission in the tilt of her head, the almost smile that lingered despite everything. Desire and fear intertwined, knotting together in a way that left my pulse racing and my mind incapable of thought. I could feel the tension crackling through the small space between us, a magnetic force that neither reason nor circumstance could resist. Every inch we shared, the brush of her hair, the warmth of her hand, the nearness of her breath, felt like a declaration. And then, as the friend lingered awkwardly at the counter, she leaned closer, almost whispering in my ear. "We can't, but we want to." Her words were both surrender and challenge, a line drawn and crossed simultaneously. My heart hammered. My fingers itched to close the gap. Everything in me knew we were teetering on the edge of something inevitable. And in that charged, impossible space, I realized one thing: nothing would ever be the same after this. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, tapping gently against the windows, as if the world itself were holding its breath for us. We sat across from each other, yet closer than ever, knees brushing, shoulders almost touching, breaths mingling in the fragile space that separated desire from restraint. Every heartbeat was a drum in my chest, echoing hers in ways I could almost feel. Her eyes searched mine, vulnerability and defiance entwined. "We can't," she whispered, but her voice trembled, betraying the lie. I leaned forward slightly, not daring to close the distance entirely, but enough to let her feel the heat of me. "I know," I breathed low, my hand inching closer to hers on the table. "But do we want to?" She didn't answer with words. She let her fingers brush mine, a touch feather-light yet electric, and leaned just a fraction closer, enough that the warmth of her body pressed into mine, a subtle but undeniable claim. I could smell the faint jasmine in her hair, the comforting warmth of her skin, and my restraint faltered. Her eyes flicked down at our hands, then back up to mine. There was a pause, a silence so loaded it vibrated through every nerve ending, and in it, I saw the truth she had been hiding, the truth I could no longer deny in myself. Desire wasn't just here. It was here to stay. "I don't care what anyone thinks," I said, voice husky, almost a whisper, leaning in closer. "I don't want to step back anymore." Her lips parted, a soft gasp escaping, her hand brushing against my forearm. The air between us felt heavy, thick with the weight of choices, and yet intoxicating in its immediacy. I wanted to close the last inch, to feel the press of her lips against mine, but the moment demanded patience, a deliberate savoring of the space before surrender. "I've waited," she murmured, and the faint catch in her voice made my chest tighten. "Longer than I thought I could." I reached up, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, my fingers lingering against her cheek. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a heartbeat, a tiny shiver running through her frame. And then, slowly, almost impossibly, our foreheads touched, breaths mingling, a soft exhale bridging the distance that had held us apart for so long. It was messy, fragile, human, raw in a way that made everything else fall away. Nothing mattered except the shared warmth, the silent acknowledgement of every glance, every hesitation, every longing that had led us here. And then, without thinking, without words, we closed the final gap. Our lips met, tentative at first, exploratory, and then with a quiet insistence, a surrender either of us could take back. It was a kiss that carried everything: the desire, the fear, the shame, the longing, the joy. When we finally pulled back, just enough to breathe, our foreheads still pressed together, we both knew. Not just that we wanted this, but that we understood each other fully, flaws, past regrets, guarded hearts, and all. The rain outside continued to fall, but inside, the world had shifted. There was clarity now, messy and human but ours. And in that moment, nothing would ever be the same. The cafe was nearly empty now, the soft drizzle outside casting a gentle haze over the streetlights. We sat side by side, not because we had to, but because neither of us wanted the space between us anymore. Her hand found mine again, fingers threading together naturally, comfortably, as though we had always belonged in this quiet, fragile closeness. I felt the warmth of her body leaning against mine, the rise and fall of her chest matching my own. There was no urgency now, no edge of forbidden tension, only a shared understanding that we had crossed the line, and it had led us somewhere undeniably real. "You were right," she whispered softly, resting her head briefly on my shoulder. "It isn't simple, but it feels right." I pressed my forehead against hers, inhaling the familiar scent of jasmine mingled with the lingering warmth of coffee. "I don't care about simple," I murmured. "I just care about us." She smiled, small and genuine, the kind that reached her eyes and made the corners crinkle in ways that were impossible not to notice. And I realized that all the hesitation, all the fear of judgment, or the age gap, had melted away in the quiet certainty of this moment. The past didn't vanish, but it became a thread that made what we had now feel richer, harder earned, and infinitely more tender. We lingered like that for a long time, hands entwined, foreheads touching, the occasional brush of lips along the temple or cheek, small gestures that carried the weight of trust and desire without ever needing to be rushed. I could feel the pulse of her heartbeat under my palm, and it synchronized with mine, a rhythm that somehow made everything outside fade into irrelevance. "I think we've waited long enough," she murmured, a hint of playfulness in her voice, though it was tempered with the gravity of all we had overcome. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Far too long," I admitted, tightening my fingers around hers. The cafe lights flickered gently as if approving our quiet surrender, casting a golden glow across her face. There was no awkwardness left, no pretense, only the messiness and beauty of human connection, the messy, soft edges of desire and affection, grounded in reality. When we finally stood, we didn't let go. Side by side, walking out into the rain under a shared umbrella, it felt like the world itself had shrunk to just the two of us. A soft brush of fingers, a tender glance, the occasional laugh breaking through the lingering tension, it was all intimacy, simple and perfect in its honesty. And in that moment, I realized that the age gap, the judgment, the lingering doubts, they were part of our story, yes, but they didn't define it. What defined it was this: two people who had dared to cross the line, to trust, to surrender, and to find clarity and joy in each other's presence. We paused at the street corner, still holding hands. I brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, kissed her forehead softly, and felt her lean into me. No words were necessary. Everything had been said in the silence, in the warmth, in the simple, human act of being together. And finally, as we walked on, side by side, hearts in sync, I knew this was only the beginning.